presentation, followed by questions from Scott and from the audience, anyone who has questions, and then we'll wrap up after that. The May webinar is being presented by Andrew Simmons. Andy is CEO of the Association for Environment Conscious Buildings, or the AECB. He's an environmentally conscious architectural designer. Describing his full background now would take longer than we have for this webinar, so we'll simply note his approach to design and construction projects is informed by the idea that sufficiency plus efficiency equals sustainability. A resource-efficient, socially and environmental sustainable approach that could be described as radical simplicity. And Andy is joined by Huda El Sharif, who's a researcher and sustainability consultant who focuses on sustainable building solutions in challenging socio-economic contexts. The AECB is the UK's longest established independent network with a common aim of promoting sustainable building. Founded as a not-for-profit in 1989, it encourages its membership to create energy-efficient and high-performance buildings, specify eco-friendly materials, innovate design and construction practice overall, aim to become more ecologically conscious, more energy and carbon literature, achieving more with less. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Andy and Huda for their presentation. Context-specific high-performance buildings, future-proofing adaptive comfort design for cooling climates. So it's over to you, Andy and Huda, and we look forward to this very much. And if everyone remains mute until the Q&A, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, it was good to be here. Let me just share the slides there. So, okay, so I'm just going to kick off with one slide. And then I'm going to hand over to Huda, and then I'm going to come back to finish off. We're going to go quite fast because this is the edited version and there's quite a lot in it. There's lots of pictures, don't worry, this is the only one with lots of words. I just wanted to just slightly set the scene as to where we're coming from here. So what we're focusing on in this presentation is domestic building. Doesn't mean that we can't, this isn't applicable to non-domestic building. We're also focusing on rural or semi-urban context, but I could better describe it as rapidly urbanizing rural contexts, perhaps. The other context is we're focusing on cooling climates, and we are trying to avoid various terms because they're not actually that useful, even if they're a bit disrespectful. So we're not using the term global south. We're being specific about the countries at the moment. So examples of the sort of countries we're talking about are Tanzania, Ghana, South Africa, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. And what we're looking at here is countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, much more so than countries with more robust infrastructure, perhaps. Although, of course, we are all climate vulnerable. Countries where economies are struggling or extremely unequal. I'm not necessarily just talking about Britain, but extremely unequal, and you could say poorer countries, and also where traditional societies are rapidly changing through industrialization. And I could talk a lot about that, just the limited amount I've seen in places like Pakistan and Africa, quite shocking speed. The ACB, we're an inspirational bunch, but we're also can be very pragmatic. Now, over the years, we have developed a common understanding, which will be recognised by all members of BAC, of what a high-performance building means. But we have been slightly questioning that in a couple of instances. One in Britain, because of the decarbonising grid, changing the balance between fabric and energy supply, low-carbon energy supply. And also in this context, we've been questioning it as well. So, the sheer scale of the challenge and the sheer speed of basically people building things that are not sustainable and will become increasingly unsustainable has made us start to think about step-by-step approaches and building on what is easier to achieve faster. So we're focusing here on optimizing what might be called traditional building strategies, but what we mustn't do is lock out further improvement that might be able to be made in some of these contexts, for example, towards achieving full passive house levels of performance, but particularly driven by climate change. And in some areas, more radical improvements to buildings will be necessary. Huda's going to look next at key differences between buildings that you could say come out of being designed to adaptive comfort criteria. I should explain a bit more about that, versus the comfort model that underpins the passive house methodology. And then we'll just whiz through a case study, just one case study, one that we understand very deeply, which is why we've chosen this one, which is a new multi-occupancy accommodation in Tanzania. Just to sort of to illustrate how this approach we're talking about might work out in practice, and worked out in practice in this situation. And then at the end, and I haven't got really any slides on this, but this is what we're thinking is all of this is a basis for a program that the ACB would like to run and that we would like BAC to support. And underpinning this is who are the experts in a program in this context. So without further ado, Huda, do you want me to just change slides when you ask me?
Yep, that's absolutely fine. So around the world, there are different climatic zones, and how you classify them depends on the system that you're using. At the very basic level, like the passive house divides them is warm, hot, cold. So it's based on temperature. But there's a lot more nuances than that. There's how arid the climate is. What are the differences between your summer and your winter? Are there any monsoons? And all these small differences impact how a building should be designed. Can you go next slide? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So traditionally, most houses were sustainable because people didn't really have an option. Electricity wasn't available. You had to be passive. And these buildings utilized these climatic nuances to create a building that was as comfortable as possible. I'm not going to say it was as comfortable as a modern building is, because there's limitations to what you can do when you're entirely relying on passive measures. But because of that nuanced design, a sustainable house looked different in each one of these climates. Now, if you think of a lot of modern houses that are not sustainable, why are they not sustainable? Because the house would look the same regardless of the climate that it's in. And electricity or energy is being used to offset that. So there is a lot of knowledge there that exists in traditional building on how to adapt to different climates. Next slide. What we also need to understand is that these buildings also adapted to the different locations that they were in, the different context. What was it, a village or a city or anywhere in between? Next slide. Now, these different contexts are also important, not just because of the location, but also because it means a different socioeconomic context. It means different levels of finances available, different levels of materials, different skills and workers available. So typically when someone thinks of a sustainable house, they think of something like this example, this passive house in Korea. They think of like a modern building that is sealed, and that is a very high performance building. But the building on the other side, the Star Homes building in Tanzania, is also a sustainable house. It's just a different type of it. It's on the other end of a spectrum. Next slide. So these buildings look different because they rely on completely different ventilation systems because of that socioeconomic conditions that are available. So the Star Homes relies on natural ventilation and on the occupants being active and interacting with the building to achieve comfort, whereas the passive house relies on the building, the mechanical system achieving that and creating a very static, steady temperature conditions inside the building. Next slide. Because of these different ventilation systems and performance different outlook to climatic control, if you were to assess these buildings, because they're different, you're going to have to assess them using a different standard. So here you have the ASHRAE standard, and it has an adaptive thermal comfort version, and it has a steady state version, which are the two schools of thoughts that you find when it comes to thermal comfort. And you'll find that they align with those two different socioeconomic contexts. The steady state comfort standard is more stringent, whereas the adaptive thermal comfort standard takes into account that people have different psychological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations. Now here I give you an example of, I used this tool and I input the same clothes, airspeed, activity level, and humidity, and all I changed was, and the temperature was the same, 28. But you can see in the adaptive comfort, it's comfortable, but in the steady state, it's not, even though everything is the same. And that just generally reflects the reality in these buildings, that the comfort range is a lot wider for an adaptive house, whereas it's a lot tighter for a steady state house like the passive house. But that doesn't mean you can label either of one of them as uncomfortable. Next slide. Because of how these two buildings approach ventilation and climatic control differently, the sustainable solutions required to reduce their consumption looks entirely different as well. So in the Star homes, you can see it's a thermally lightweight building. They don't use glass. It looks like it from the photo, but that's actually just mosquito netting. It's entirely open to the outdoor air to maximize on ventilation. It uses shading, and it's just open and breezy. Whereas the passive house uses the exact opposite. It relies on creating a bubble, separating the internal environment from the external. And because of that, it relies on high levels of insulation, high levels of airtightness to keep the heat and the humidity from entering into the building. Next slide. This difference, this huge difference between the two houses is because it's a hot, humid climate. But in this example, this is from my research in Sudan, which is a hot, dry climate. The differences between an air-conditioned space and a naturally ventilated space that's used during the day is very minimal. The only difference is how much volume is optimal. If anything, there's bigger differences when you optimize a space to be naturally ventilated and used during the day, or if it's used during the night. So again, even these differences in optimization it are different whether you're in a hot, humid climate or a hot, dry climate. Next slide. But again, those two buildings kind of represent two ends, a black and a white. They're completely different. But the reality is, in the developing countries, most buildings are somewhere in the middle, because as we mentioned before, these are rapidly industrializing contexts, and you will have a mix and match of situations where it doesn't fit into either of those boxes. Next slide. So you have the Star home, which is the naturally ventilated one, it's on one end, and then you have the passive house on the other. In the middle, you have mixed mode buildings that suit people who have a context that's in the middle. So what do I mean by a context in the middle? It could be that you don't have enough finances for a fully air-conditioned building, but you also want a higher comfort level than possibly achievable by a natural ventilated building, which is a lot of what is happening in these contexts. And what people do is they just add an air conditioner to a building that is naturally ventilated. So what we're trying to do is to plan for that, to create mixed mode buildings where there is that fluidity and movement. So our current eco-village design falls closer to the naturally ventilated end, but we're hoping to create a design where in the future it can be run as more air conditioned in parts of it, not the entire house, and then it can go back to being fully naturally ventilated during like seasons where it's not as hot. So again, a pragmatic approach where we can't fully air condition the building, but we need more comfort than a naturally ventilation building can provide. So we create zones in the building that can function as that. Next slide. And the reason this is important is because just creating a reduction of 1 degree can have an impact. Just creating a reduction of 1 hour that is spent not in a completely air-conditioned space can make a difference. Every little counts, since we can't, it's trying to move away from an all or nothing approach, trying to do as much as we can with the resources that we have. Next slide.
Thanks, Huda. That's great. I always enjoy listening to you, even though I've heard it several times now. So this is a whiz through the case study. In essence, it's a project that was asking for basically to create a prototype house which would accommodate 10 orphans, same-sex orphans, with a house mother. This is basically where we've got to. The house is built, the girls are poised to move in. There's just some remedial works that need to be done. Just so you can start to get a sense of some of the features of this building visually, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. So we obviously want this, what we're doing, to ripple out into the local community. So this eco-village sits within a larger community of villages and developments and businesses and so on. So broadly speaking, most housing in Tanzania seems to be provided through in what academics seem to call the informal housing supply. So that's anything from very basic shelters, and that's either for shops or workshops, and then houses out the back, to the middle class houses, which you see in the middle there, sort of typical middle class homes. And that's really a self-build process where certain patterns of building are chosen, and then local tradespeople are engaged, or a contractor firm who does the whole thing. I think typically it's a series of trades managed quite slowly over time. Foundations go in, and then walls are built, and then, you know, sometime later, when the money's been saved up, the roof goes on, and so on. Each house in the villages I've seen has quite a decent garden. Not self-sufficient size garden, but sort of a, you know, quite a decent garden. And then the sewage goes into a septic tank and is technically meant to be being emptied, but they basically just sit there, I think, overflowing into the sand. That's another issue we've been dealing with, which we're not covering here. And then you have a series of quite large numbers, not the majority of homes, but quite large numbers of developer led homes, which are designed specifically for air conditioning. Now, we all know that inefficient air conditioning is very expensive to run. It can be very carbon intensive, and pretty typically much is, depending on a country's particular mix of electricity generation. Now, Tanzania has quite a lot of hydropower, but of course, when the power cuts, which can be quite long, happen, people can put on dirty diesel generators to sort of provide backup in extreme weather, where the aircon is sort of creating a peak demand, and that makes the grid a lot dirtier. It's the whole issue of refrigerants leaking, which we obviously have to sort of manage in this country as well. We know the problems with too much and too fast use of aircon where it is being run inefficiently. Now, in the developer-led homes, and Hood has spoken very eloquently on this in other countries, when there are power cuts, buildings that are designed specifically to rely on air conditioning are very vulnerable during power cuts. Now, of course, the other thing, of course, is that air quality, indoor air quality, doesn't really come into this when you've got an aircon on. The windows are either shut, sometimes the curtains are closed in order to sort of help make it more efficient. Maybe the bathroom window, a little square window, is left open just for a bit of ventilation, but air quality is generally poor in these type of arrangements. So where can we help? Well, where are we thinking that our optimized traditional approach can help? We think, you know, probably not the formal housing supply. You know, maybe the sort of interesting conversations could happen, and thinking about going straight to passive house with developers. Maybe that's a sort of a vector for passive house, but certainly in this informal housing supply sector, we think we can help, because there are some easy wins: better orientation, better shading, more reflective materials to reflect heat shedding from roofs, better coordination in this. I think some business opportunities in window design to do with insect protection and security and shading and privacy. Some quite clever ideas could come out of that could form the basis of businesses. Better cross ventilation and stack effect arrangements, relatively simple things that can be done to, as Huda says, just make that little bit of difference, either reduce temperature or better higher airflow for cooling. And of course, then a bit more tricky, but how do we encourage people to plan ahead so that when they do come to fit an aircon, it's likely to be easy to install without too much demolition, and also runs efficiently. So the site itself, just excuse me while I shut the door. Hey. I'll be honest, that was some teenagers being noisy. Sorted. So here's the site, 30-acre site. It was donated to the charity for the purpose of developing it for an orphanage. Basically, it is the swamp of the area, a very pretty ecologically rich swamp, it was bulldozed before the charity stopped it and said, no, we don't want it bulldozed, we want to have it as it is. But it is basically the drainage basin for the surrounding area. Now, they're lucky because they fundraised and put boreholes in, so they have good drinking water, which they can also use for agricultural purposes. They've got a dedicated area that they retained for wildlife. So there's a sort of quite a rich, interesting wildlife in that bottom corner there, which of course comes and goes across the boundaries. There's some nice cooling winds that move across the site. Factories, of course, have been coming in, and they tend to be built around watercourses with some very impressive looking environmental protection plans, which are, it appears, almost without exception, not implemented properly. Now, for the last 10 years, this has been going on whilst East Africa has been suffering a drought, very dry weather and droughts. As you probably picked up in the news, that appears to have turned to more intense rain. And so there has been a lot of flooding, including affecting the eco-village. But a lot of these developments, this urbanization, and this is an old map, so actually there's a lot more housing around the eco-village now. That's been built during that dry period. And now what we're seeing is increased runoff and speed of runoff from those houses and those developments right into the eco-village. And that's been something that's been going on these last 2 or 3 weeks. We have been having to deal with. Noise is another issue. At the moment, it's not traffic noise, it's amplified music, church noise, church PR is something I noticed there. And of course, along with the factories and along with the runoff from the houses, we are seeing oil and other material and other pollutants going into the watercourses. In the case of the factories, that can be quite serious. In the case of washing cars and trucks and so on, that can be quite serious and so on. So that's a growing concern. And then, of course, the wildlife doesn't respect the boundaries, and monkeys and snakes and insects are not something that the increasing numbers of people around the site are always that keen on. So there's quite a lot of liaison going on between the eco-village and the local council and the local community. We've had some very strong winds, which I haven't seen before, which took off part of the roof, and that was due to defects in workmanship, which we've now sorted. And whether they were there before or not, or whether it's because the previous contractor used untreated timber, which was apparently it was meant to be treated, we've had wood wasps causing a lot of damage in the timber, which we've now rectified. So you can see there's a lot going on, mosquitoes, obviously. There's a lot going on this site and locally. Now, the design brief, this is a few short slides now. The original design brief in 2017 was basically accommodate 10 children and their mother, large multi-purpose space and bedrooms and toilet block. And we decided that actually the thermal conditions under the large cashew nut tree, which is where everybody met for meetings and so on, were pretty perfect. And that is what we should aim for, with the added, obviously, features of weather protection, mosquito protection, security and privacy for the girls. As an aside, one of the colleagues in this group we're building, Dr. Ben Roberts, has been working out in Ghana, and one of their projects is to actually look at what are the conditions in existing housing, what are the thermal conditions. And as you can imagine from the way that housing is now built, and even some of the older, more traditional housing with the thatched roofs, those are very uncomfortable and unhealthy temperatures to be living and working with. We, of course, needed a benchmark to see whether our ideas would work. The charity accepted the idea of building a test unit, which is on the right, and the existing houses they have on site, which were overheating. This isn't the only reason they asked for new houses, but they were overheating. So we looked at monitoring both, basically, so we could see whether our proposed ideas worked. We got some very useful data back from the test unit. We compared it, benchmarked it to the existing house. The little building we designed with these features did seem to stay cooler. Well, it did stay cooler during the day, and it cooled down more quickly at night, but there were still problems which we picked up through this monitoring. So as part of the design for the actual house, the main 10-person house, we just made sure that we sorted those problems at design stage, particularly cross ventilation and enhancing the stack effect, enlarging windows, and a few other tweaks. And then that's basically what we built. So you can see a little diagram there, bottom right. The windows are tricky. The roofs, the heat shedding, the hot roofs allowing hot air to escape from the attics, drawing air through the building, the extensive wall shading, and so on. Those are relatively easy things. Windows are tricky. So in this particular case, we found a local factory, and it was local, that could do laser cutting of steel sheets. So rather than steel bars across the windows, we had a decorative pattern that we had colleagues, Hannah and Otis, helped us with. A decorative pattern that acts as security, a degree of shading, although there's not a lot of sun falls on those windows, and then a removable panel with insect mesh behind that. So that's the second layer. That obviously slows the cooling air down through the windows, but doesn't impede it too much. And then what we're not sure about is whether there is enough, and this is where we need feedback from the girls when they're in, is there enough privacy with that filtering, that visual filtering? It may be that we don't need further privacy. And then do we need also for the girls to perhaps stop so much air coming through the windows, because they might feel cold at 25 degrees. Some people there will put on a jumper. We wouldn't, I don't. But we have to be aware of that, of those different sort of levels of adaptation to local temperatures. So we analysed the data, cut it, diced it, understood it, and then tried to think, how can we take our experience of that building, the forthcoming feedback from the girls, and actually sort of use the comfort models we have to predict future designs. Now, this is where I'm going to ask Huda just to step in for the two slides here. Huda, if you don't mind.
So when we were assessing, this is an adaptive thermal comfort model because this building is naturally ventilated. But the problem is, for an adaptive thermal comfort model to be accurate, it needs to be from local standards as much as possible, because each region has their own thermal comfort temperature and thermal comfort range. So there isn't anything that is specifically for Tanzania that we could use. So we did two models to try out and understand. The first is the ASTRAI adaptive thermal comfort model, which is the more generic one, and it's used for hot, humid, and dry climates. So it's just a really good starting point, and it initially shows us that we do have some overheating, as you can see from the daily mean of around 29. You can see on that top area, there is a bit of overheating. Next slide. But then we found another thermal comfort model that has humidity put into it. So it had 3 different tiers for hot, dry climates and hot, humid climates. And we used the hot, humid criteria. And when you look at that, it looks like we're doing quite good. It's really comfortable. If anything, there is a bit of overcooling that is happening. And again, like Andy mentioned, we might actually need to somehow slow down the winds, because one caveat of this model is that it has to have high air speeds, because otherwise it won't be comfortable. So we can't just say, oh, the building is comfortable as is. We know from our research that the building can achieve quite good air speeds, and we're also planning to supplement that with a good fan design to make sure that when there isn't any air, the occupants can be comfortable. We can't just rely on temperatures alone.
Yes, thanks. The one thing that we haven't had time to put into this slideshow, which I will mention, is that we're trying to use the real life data we're getting to calibrate the models that we use to assess a design stage. So Huda has done some insulation modeling to see how much sun falls on the building and just to sort of assess shading features. She's also had a look at computational fluid dynamics, CFD, which basically looks at likely airflow and air speeds across the building, just to sort of test out some of our more whimsical ideas about double height spaces and cross ventilation ideas. And what we're trying to do is obviously to calibrate the tools for particular climate regions so that we can anticipate designs rather than just monitoring what's built, which is a much slower way of learning. Future developments then. So there are some interesting potential for different coatings on metal roofs, which is a sort of low-cost, fast retrofit. There's a very interesting organisation which we want to be part of our group, MERS, which is basically Mirrors to Cool the World, and they've been doing research into how in South Africa, well, in all countries all around the world, looking at the benefits of changing the surface coatings and colours of shantytown roofs, which is interesting. There are simple things like fan design. Hood has mentioned that. So ceiling fans, but also sometimes wall-mounted fans are better. And also we want to explore task fans just to sort of to check the effectiveness of placing the fans in different places and having the freedom to move those around. It's pretty obvious to us, moving across the site in the eco-village, it's a lot cooler in the areas where trees have been planted, but it takes time for those to grow, and there are issues about whether you're trying to use food trees, and that there's an animal issue to that. So that is definitely a no-brainer, but takes longer. But of course, what we do have to be really on top of is how do we future-proof these spaces, knowing that some people will be putting aircon in. So the question is our approach open to allow if we were to do the step-by-step approach based on optimizing adaptive comfort measures in building design, are we looking out future improvement to either, let's call it, passive house retrofit standards in the medium or longer term future? So that's a little bit more complicated. We started thinking about that, and we're going to do some modeling in the next few weeks to sort of start exploring that. I guess that's the next step for us. How might that look? You'll all be familiar with the sort of things you have to do to take a building to passive house. Now, we haven't got time. In questions, maybe we can tease out some of this. I think we've still got time for that. So there are complications, but we've started thinking about it. And Huda's sort of approach of zoning so that future further improvements of buildings doesn't have to be taken the whole building to passive house levels. Zones could be taken, bedrooms, for example, bedrooms, study rooms, whereas the living room areas, for example, could manage to ride through heat waves without using air conditioning because of patterns of activity. Not going to go into this case study, but this is 4 other houses on site, need to be retrofitted. So the clients have asked us to apply the same principles to these buildings. The orientation is completely different. So we're just looking at how we do that. And then final slide, that's just Tanzania. Our network is sort of, we've got opportunities to look at other countries. We have northern Pakistan here, Gilgit-Baltistan, and Sindh province down the south of Pakistan. And of course, I mentioned Ben Roberts working in Ghana here. So who are the experts? Well, not architects, we think. There's a lot of mileage in work that people are already doing, but is not perhaps been elevated enough or turned into guidance that's available to more people. There's some very effective buildings out there which use these passive techniques, and a lot of buildings have been put up that with very minor tweaks could make some big differences in terms of temperature and cross ventilation. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation. I must say that what you're doing is extraordinarily impressive. I do have some questions that I've put together that I'd like to ask, but as I like to tell everybody, I will always give preference to the audience who might want to ask questions. So if you've got a question, raise your hand and you can ask it or put it in the chat. Now, I do see that we already have a question, and I have to be true to my word, so I'm going to ask what Mike Oldak has asked. How do you incorporate energy use into the design? Is that from solar panels? Do you have flexible loads conceived to prevent overbuilding the electric infrastructure? Because the building isn't going to be in isolation, it's part of a community of buildings. How do you take account of that?
I'll say something first, Huda, but I'm sure you've got your views on that. So with the Eco Village particularly, when we started, there was no grid connection to the Eco Village. Other buildings on site had very small solar panels, small batteries, which ran the lights and the fans, the ceiling fans. And that's pretty much all they needed, actually. So that was kind of our plan to do that, which is semi-autonomous sort of approach. But I think it was a couple of years ago or so, there was a choice of should we connect to the grid? And they said, no, we should be autonomous. So we said, no, just connect to the grid, you know, get it done. But the energy consumption of this approach is very low because we're basically running low power lighting and fans, low power fans. Now, possibly in the future, people will maybe think about getting a refrigerator to extend food maybe further into the season. But at the moment, they seem to be, it's a very low use lifestyle and building design. Wouldn't you say, Huda?
Yeah, I think it doesn't need a lot. And to be honest, there are batteries that are already attached to fans. So I think utilizing things like that would be really helpful because of power cuts. And that will help with that question of overloading the grid using those batteries because there's not a lot of consumption going on.
All right, well, thank you. There's a question that came up while we were chit-chatting before the formal presentation started from Jeff, talking about how temperatures are rising so radically fast that there's a belief now that 1.5 degrees is in the rearview mirror. Probably 2 degrees is also in the rearview mirror, and we're heading towards something higher than that. And that doesn't sound like much, 2 degrees, but when you look at Asia, particularly East Asia, where they've had 47 degrees and higher on a sustained basis. Do you have thoughts on how do you future-proof? Because some of the natural ventilation you've described for Tanzania seems appropriate in current conditions, but in another country with 47 degrees, oof, that becomes challenging.
It's pretty frightening. Huda, what do you think?
Yeah. So again, you go back to that question of social and economic context. So for example, a house in Kuwait where you will find those temperatures, you will find 50 degrees, and they do have the resources to achieve a passive house. I would recommend definitely in that case, having a fully air-conditioned building that is sealed, that is as insulated as possible, because also the comfort level, the standard of comfort in those contexts is very, very high. So that is what they are going to do anyway. But what if, for example, that 47 degrees is in a country like my country, Sudan, where people do have air conditioners, but they don't have the finances for that. So this is where the idea that I suggest of creating a zone where you could air condition, where people have a refuge, where they have somewhere to go when it's extreme and they need shelter, or else it will affect them. Because I've experienced it myself where there's a power cut and it's really, really hot to the point you just slow down, you just lie down because you don't want to move, you don't want to do any activity, nothing works. So it impacts your quality of life, it impacts every aspect of your life. So it's really important to have somewhere to be when that happens.
All right.
I think what I would say to that as well is that there are limits to where this is going to be appropriate. And as I said, we try not to lock out the future improvements. That's partly an answer. But MEAS, the organisation I mentioned previously, they're working in quite built up areas in South Africa where there's very little scope to do anything other than perhaps change the colour of your metal roofing. But it shouldn't be underestimated how much effect that actually has. These are simple effects that can reduce temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees inside a building, which allows the people who are trying to work in that building, they can go in and use their building during the day. So yeah, it's not just about ventilation, it's also about shading and reflectivity. And I think there's enough potential here to warrant really going for it, but there are very real limits, and certainly we don't know each region exactly how it's going to react to the global average increase in temperatures. But I think we've got a pretty good idea now to help us focus what we do where.
It's interesting you talk about changing the color of the roofs so that the buildings can stay cooler. If we're talking about rapid urbanization, where you've got all of the mobility infrastructure around the buildings, simply the fact of having black roads means that your urban heat island effect is enormous.
Yeah.
That's probably beyond your purview, but it would seem to be an important feature.
I think the way thinking about these measures should, if there was enough support, I think part of the problem is these solutions are quite well known, but don't get implemented at scale. And I guess what we're hoping through Building Action Coalition is because you're setting yourselves up, or us up, to be able to get the message out there and take it to larger audiences with a certain weight and gravitas. So I think that's what's needed, because these are easy wins that could then, obviously a highways engineer would see, be obvious, wouldn't it, to change the color of the tarmac on a road system. Yeah.
All right, I'm giving an opportunity for Huda to come in if you'd like. If not, I'll keep going. I'm getting more questions from the audience. One is one that I pondered earlier, but Bob beat me to the punch. How receptive are you finding people to some of these wacky ideas from other countries? Are they prepared to take on board your concepts?
So it's interesting, because at the Eco Village, we started out with we will get a contractor in. That hasn't worked so well, getting a contractor in. The Eco Village staff, who basically have labouring skills, were looking at them and going, oh goodness, we could do that. And of course we did, you know, it wasn't sort of, didn't seem credible, we could do that. Well, you know, but actually, as it turns out, to cut long story short, they have been repairing the poor quality work of the main contractors with their profit motive, their corner cutting motives that we, you know, you have to accept are there. And they've done a really good job. So already now, of course, they're also experienced in the building, and there are sort of 15 staff, and then there's the girls, and then they go to school and so on. So I think it's early days, and all we can do is have a few anecdotes at the moment to see how receptive people are. Now, this site is apparently going to, I've been told by the clients, they have got permission that the president of Tanzania is going to open the building. Now, that's a pretty good way of raising the profile of something like this. We had a lorry driver turn up with a delivery, and he went into the building and he said, oh, this is amazing. Why can't Tanzania have more of this sort of thing? And I said, what are you trying to find out? What was he relating to? It was modern looking, but it wasn't, it was modern looking and light and airy and bright. He liked that. He did notice that it was cool and felt nice to be in there, but he also felt that he liked the innovation. He said this could really catch on in Tanzania, because people like, it's a pride thing about having, you know, having something innovative, I suppose, and we all respond to that, don't we? But as I said, anecdotes at the current moment.
I think the project is innovative, yes, but also one of the key things I noticed, Andy, that you've really focused on is not doing something that the locals couldn't do themselves, not bringing in something that is so foreign that they can't replicate. So yes, it's innovative, but it's within to what they're used to. So the concept, for example, we don't have any glazing. That's not a new concept to them. In their own houses, they don't have glazing. So we're not introducing a new concept. We're just optimizing what's already there.
And it is a simple, it's to be honest, it's a relief. We do passive houses in the UK, but in Tanzania, there are simple layers of construction. It's just a block wall that's rendered, you know, amazing. And we have to make it as drafty as possible, but it's block work, it's metal roofs, it's local materials. It's just in a slightly different configuration, but basically, as Huda says, accessible and understandable.
All right.
Andy was your, so sorry, Scott, I couldn't resist. Andy, was your local cowboy contractor not a benefit in terms of making it as drafty as possible?
Well, actually, no, that's not true, because the existing homes, not all of them, but if you have the money, you close off the attic roof. You have, you know, you can get UPVC now to close off the eaves and the soffits. And then your attic becomes inaccessible, so you can't get the fruit bats out that get in there, and then they sort of crack through the ceilings. It gets incredibly hot in that trapped, unventilated space, and the ceilings are a lot hotter in those spaces. So actually, no, they're trying to close the gaps. So it's the opposite situation as we get here when we're trying to persuade builders to build things airtight.
I've got two more questions in the chat. I'm going to jump over mics, but I will come back if we have time, because I want to give everybody to get their question in. Unfortunately, I don't really understand Mark's question, so I'm going to actually have him come on and explain it. I'll read it out to you. Do you see a need to update the boundary conditions for psychometric charts in a 3-degree future? If you understand the question, go ahead and answer it. Otherwise, I'll make Mark explain it.
You know, I mean, in a really hot future, those lookup tables for how we design buildings are a pretty narrow box of, somebody that might not need to put on the jumper or, do natural ventilation. So do we need to relax those and kind of expand what we think is reasonable in a really hot future? And, so does that affect the way you design buildings? And maybe a second is, have you,
So-
contacted health departments to really understand, the cooling conditions, like fans don't always actually cool your core body temperatures. That can be dangerous sometimes.
Yeah. So if you look at countries like India, they have a lot of research, and you find each state has its own standard where they've done research and they found that our people are comfortable to these temperatures. The problem with a lot of these standards is that they're international, that they're considered, for example, the whole of America will take the ASHRAE standard, whereas America is a lot of different climatic regions. So I think, yes, it does need to be updated, but also you have to consider a person in India has this wider range because they are used to this climate for the past few years. So to get a person, for example, who's in Los Angeles to used to these climates, it will take several years of getting used to these higher temperatures. And then I'll say, yes, it could be relaxed later on when people are used to it. But if they're not already exposed to it for several years, they don't have that capacity yet.
If we're talking about absolute limits, Huda, you mentioned to me that research shows that if air temperature is over 32 degrees, it doesn't matter how much air you blow past somebody, you're not cooling them.
Yeah. So because air cools you by helping you sweat, but if the air that's coming to you is hotter than your skin, it's not going to help with evaporation. So using ventilation to cool has a huge limitation. After 32 degrees, it's not really useful. And it's also not really useful when it's super humid and you're not sweating anyway because of how humid it is. So again, it still has limitations.
All right, the last question I think we can ask, if not, I've got another one if it's time allows, again from Mike. He has said something in a slightly different way, but I have the same view. If you are going for independence from the power network because you've got your own power on the roof and you don't have very much load in the house, is the lack of connection to the grid, the power grid, is the lack of access to telecommunications somehow preventing economic opportunities for people because they don't have access to the internet, they can't do those kinds of transactions?
I think I probably haven't been clear on this. That's not what we're recommending to the client, actually.
Okay.
What we're actually recommending is go for grid connection,
Okay.
be connected. Yeah, no, I was just saying that up until the point we were asked, the previous homes had gone that route. And it's because they didn't have grid connection. But even after they had grid connection, they were still thinking, should we say no to grid connection? Should we go the autonomous? And we said, no, don't go autonomous. Connect to the grid. It doesn't particularly matter, really, because the loads are so low. There is a conversation around cooking that comes into this. Air quality, cooking. I've been talking to Jeff a bit. He's been asking questions about air quality because obviously this whole approach is a naturally ventilated approach. So you have issues of when you've got rapid urbanization, there is this question, is it inevitable everybody wants to close a house up, put glass in the windows, turn the aircon on, cut out the noise, cut out the pollution that's building up outside? Now, that's a really interesting one because in the villages just outside, which are being built in the way I showed with sort of naturally ventilated, open windows with some insect mesh and iron bars, but basically open. Now, they have built, in effect, a rather charming little village with narrow roads between it and gardens, which are completely not suited to the cars that occasionally, like us, try to get through to get to the eco-village. Now, because they are able to hear each other and they do have to breathe each other's air, in a way, isn't that meaning that they're jointly responsible for their environment in a way that if you just close everything up and, shut your front door? So that's an interesting discussion, I think, whether what chicken and egg, if you take this approach, will you build cleaner, greener communities?
All right, we're down to our final 5 moments. And I think if we open up further discussions, I'd be going over the edge, and we always promise people that we won't do that. I think we would love to work with you to get greater visibility and make people really aware of what it is you're achieving and accomplishing. So we're delighted to partner with you in getting those words out.
Fantastic.
The idea of creating the kind of industrial ecosystem so that the materials that are needed for the passive standard are available locally. Is there a big challenge in that area, or is it simply a matter of the government policy getting on with it? Do you have a view on that?
Well, next week, this week and next week, we're going to ask Greengage Consultancy to help us model the house as if it were a passive house. And I think what I'm going to ask them to do specifically is to follow Huda's zoning plan and ask them to model the bedroom areas as an air-conditioned unit, which may require, with ventilation and maybe dehumidification. So the question is, what kit can you get, and how likely it is that in the next few years you'll be able to get that and the skills that go with it? Right. And the feeling is it's too slow. It's too slow. It will take longer than that. However, to create an environment to run aircon efficiently, probably require internal wall insulation. Now, there are some possibilities for natural fiber-based internal wall insulation. There are some closer opportunities for that. To close the windows off in a way that doesn't compromise the inset mesh and stuff, who just came up with a nice bifold door system, which actually allows you to open it so you can have multi-mode, it's open or it's shut. That could work. So insulation types throws up this whole issue of, do we want to go the route we went, where you have lots of plastic-based installations and microplastics and pollution coming in? My gut feeling is, don't go there if you can go somewhere else, So that's another question. But in terms of like getting an efficient, if not totally passive house building, I think that is more possible. And I think it's probably largely around the heat recovery, ventilation systems. That seems a long way away. So I think it's about ventilation. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to have to, Huda,
yeah, I just have a small addition. Yeah. So part of my research in Sudan, I was looking into how technologies were adopted, how air conditioning was adopted, and I found a pattern that exists. It's that people in the middle and upper class, they find something abroad that they like, they bring it into Sudan, they started to import it, and then the demand increases, whereas other people say, oh, we really like this. And then because of that increase in demand, a local supplier comes and starts supplying it, but it's still imported. And then the final step is that local production starts. So that pattern has always happened. So I feel if you want to introduce a new technology, you have to follow that pattern. You have to start importing something and letting people see it. And then from there, start with the local supplier and then local production. That is kind of the only way to go, to be honest.
Very good insight. Thank you very much. I will note for all of the participants that there's another comment from Kamran Shahzad in the chat. I invite you to read that. But I need to shut up and turn it back over to Barbara Ann. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Huda. That's been fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy and Huda and Scott. That's been most interesting, absolutely. And I want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on our website. We'll be uploading it to our website over the next few days, and we can you can get that on escorttheforum.org. So it will be there. And to remind you that our next BAC Learning Webinar will take place on June 12th from 4 to 5 p.m. Irish time, and we will stick to the hour so that people know you're coming on for an hour. So you're given an hour from your busy day, your busy month to come on. So anyone that wants to present our BAC Learning Webinar, please contact me. We would love to schedule you throughout the rest of the year if you're interested. So thank you very, very much. That's been most interesting, and we'll end it there and let everyone off within the hour as we promised. Thanks so much, Andy and Huda, again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.